I want you to take a moment and just like really think about the last time you sat down to dinner.
Right.
Maybe you had a steak or maybe some roast chicken or even just a quick deli sandwich on your lunch break.
Yeah, exactly.
How much thought did you actually put into how that meat got onto your plate?
Probably very little. I mean, most people don't.
No, they don't. And I don't just mean the supply chain or the logistics or, the trip to the grocery store. I mean the absolute fundamental mechanics of it.
The literal taking of the life.
Yes, because for most of us listening right now, there is this massive silent disconnect between the living, breathing animal and the neatly shrink-wrapped package we toss into our shopping carts.
Oh, absolutely. It's the ultimate modern luxury.
Right. We expect it to be clean, we expect it to be safe for our families, but the actual process of getting it there, we generally prefer that to remain completely out of sight and out of mind.
Because it's uncomfortable. The ability to consume on a massive scale without ever having to confront the reality of the transaction, that's a very new phenomenon. Modern society has completely outsourced the ethical, the physical, and the psychological weight of taking a life for sustenance.
Yeah, we'll just delegate the messy reality to industrial systems so we can focus entirely on the culinary result.
Exactly.
But what if you couldn't do that? What if the food on your plate was governed by a set of rules so incredibly precise, so philosophically deep, and, well, sometimes so genuinely surprising, that every single bite was tied to this massive framework of ethics, anatomy, and theology?
That changes the entire experience of eating.
It really does. And that is exactly our mission for today's deep dive. We are looking at a fascinating ancient legal text, specifically the Book of Slaughter from classical Islamic jurisprudence.
Which is just an incredible document.
It is. Now, if you're picturing like a simple cookbook or a brief list of dietary suggestions, you're in for a shock.
Yeah, it is far from a cookbook.
Right. This is a highly detailed legal and spiritual manual. It dictates exactly what makes meat lawful or halal to consume.
To truly understand the gravity of this text, we really have to grasp its core premise. Everything in this framework revolves around a concept called thaka.
Thaka. Okay.
Yeah. And if we translate it roughly, it means lawful slaughter.
Yeah.
But its deeper linguistic root actually ties to purification.
Oh, interesting. So it's not just about killing the animal.
Not at all. The text establishes that this act of thaka serves a profound dual purpose. On a purely physical, biological level, it is an extraction process.
Meaning extracting what exactly?
It's about separating the impure, which, in a specific biological framework, is the flowing blood from the pure, which is the meat left behind.
Got it. So that's the physical side.
Right. But on a spiritual level, it establishes the purity of the act itself. It provides the legal and theological justification for taking a living creature's life by ensuring it is done strictly according to divine parameters. And throughout our analysis today, we are going to be exploring the differing opinions of some of the most towering figures in classical Islamic legal history.
Right, the heavyweights.
Exactly. We're talking about foundational scholars like Abu Hanifa, Imam Shafi'i, and Imam Malik.
And it's amazing to see them argue over these tiny details.
It really is. Watching these brilliant, rigorous legal minds debate the implications of a single anatomical cut or a single spoken word, it offers a masterclass in how legal systems attempt to structure human morality.
Okay, let's unpack this, because if we are talking about a process that requires this immense level of precision, the very first question has to be, who is actually allowed to hold the knife?
A very crucial question.
Right. If this is a spiritual and physical contract, I imagine not just anyone can walk up and do the job. There has to be some sort of barrier to entry.
There is a massive barrier to entry, and it is entirely theological. The text outlines the qualifications of the slaughterer with incredible strictness. First and foremost, the person must be a believer in monotheism.
Okay, so belief in one God.
Precisely. In the context of this jurisprudence, that means they must be either a Muslim whose belief is rooted in the Islamic creed, or they must be someone from the people of the book,
Which means
which specifically refers to Jews and Christians. The legal framework states that meat slaughtered by the people of the book is lawful based on explicit scriptural permission found within the Quran itself.
Okay, so it's a shared theological baseline.
Yeah, the foundational non-negotiable requirement is that the act of taking a life must be fundamentally connected to the recognition of a single divine creator.
Well, if the underlying mechanism is that you have to recognize the creator to lawfully take the life of the creation, that obviously implies some strict exclusions. Who is standing outside of this theological boundary?
The jurisprudence is very direct about who is excluded. For example, the slaughter performed by a Zoroastrian, who are referred to in these classical texts as Magians, is strictly forbidden.
Oh, really? Even though they were a major religion at the time.
Yeah. The legal texts cite a specific historical tradition stating that while Zoroastrians should be treated similarly to the people of the book in certain civic and societal matters, like taxation or protection, the law explicitly forbids the eating of their slaughtered meat or intermarrying with them.
Okay, so there's a hard line drawn there. Who else?
Furthermore, an apostate, someone who has formally renounced and left the Islamic faith, cannot perform the slaughter.
Ah, because they broke the contract.
Exactly. The logic here is that they no longer hold a recognized, valid religious covenant. And the same absolute prohibition applies to polytheists or idolaters. Because they do not possess the necessary belief in an undivided monotheism, they lack the theological authority to initiate this specific contract of thaka.
Now, I want to look at a very specific edge case I noticed in the source material because it really threw me for a loop.
Okay, what was it?
We just established that the qualification is based on your belief system, right?
Right.
But there is one exclusion here that has absolutely nothing to do with what religion you belong to, but rather where you physically are and what specific state of being you are in.
Ah, you're talking about the pilgrim.
Yes. It talks about a pilgrim in the state of Edom. I need you to break down what is happening here because it feels like a total jurisdictional clash.
It is a brilliant example of overlapping legal jurisdictions. So when a Muslim undertakes the sacred pilgrimage to Mecca, either the major pilgrimage of Hajj or the minor one of Umrah, they enter a highly specific consecrated state of ritual purity.
And that state is Edom.
Exactly. This state is known as Edom. While a person is actively in this state of Edom, or even if they're just physically standing within the sacred geographic precincts of Mecca, which is known as the haram, hunting wild game, is strictly, unequivocally prohibited.
So it's essentially a massive wildlife sanctuary where human predation is put on pause.
That is a very good way to conceptualize it. It is a sanctuary of absolute peace. So the text lays out a very elegant legal syllogism here.
Okay, lay it on me.
The act of thaka, lawful slaughter, is inherently a legally sanctioned, permitted act, right?
Right.
It generates a lawful result, which is halal meat. However, hunting while in the state of Edom is a specifically prohibited unlawful act. The legal rule here is that you cannot use a prohibited action as the vehicle to achieve a legally sanctioned result.
Oh, wow.
So if a pilgrim in Iram goes out and slaughters a wild deer, it does not count as lawful saka. The entire act is legally void, and the resulting meat is forbidden carrion.
Wait, but what if they're just hungry and, need to eat a sheep they brought with them? Are they forced to be vegetarian during the entire pilgrimage?
No. No, the law makes a very sharp distinction here based on the nature of the animal. If the pilgrim slaughters a domesticated animal, like a sheep, a goat, a camel, that is perfectly lawful.
Okay, so livestock is fine.
Yeah, the prohibition tied to Iram is specifically targeted at the act of hunting and dispatching wild game. It is about disrupting the peace of the wild within the sanctuary. The routine slaughter of livestock for sustenance does not violate that specific sanctuary law.
Okay, that makes sense. It's like having a general law that says driving is legal, but a specific zoning law that says you can't drive your car through a public park.
Yes, the specific overrides the general.
Exactly. But let's bring it back down to the baseline qualifications of the person holding the knife. We've established they need to be a monotheist and they can't be hunting in a sacred sanctuary.
Right.
But what about basic physical and mental capacity? I noticed that the text explicitly states that a child or a woman or even someone who might be considered legally incompetent in other financial or societal areas can validly perform the slaughter.
Yes, it does.
I want to challenge this. If we're going to get into some incredibly precise anatomical requirements later on, doesn't handing the knife to a young child risk botching the cut and causing the animal immense suffering? Does physical strength not matter at all here?
It is a very natural concern, and the jurists actually anticipated it. The text addresses this through a vital conditional clause. It states that these individuals, the child, the woman, the person with atypical mental faculties, can perform the slaughter only if they possess the ability to comprehend and control the act.
Define comprehend and control in this context. Like, what
Yeah.
does that actually mean?
Well, it means they must conceptually understand the necessity, the spiritual invocation, which we will dissect shortly, and they must possess the baseline physical coordination to execute the specific neck cut correctly.
So they have to know what they're doing and have the motor skills to do it.
Precisely. If a child is so young that they simply do not understand what they're doing, Or if they lack the motor control to manage the blade safely and effectively, their slaughter is legally invalid.
Okay, so it's not a free-for-all.
Right. What the jurisprudence is doing here is radically separating spiritual qualification from societal status or sheer physical dominance. Gender, societal rank, or age do not inherently disqualify a human being from participating in the spiritual contract of taking a life for food, provided they meet the cognitive and physical baseline of the task.
I really like to think of this as a highly specialized operator's license.
Oh, that's a good analogy.
Yeah, like if you go down to the DMV to get your driver's license, the instructor holding the clipboard doesn't care if you are an Olympic weightlifter or a slightly built high school student.
They don't care at all.
They care about two things. Do you have the cognitive awareness to understand what a red light means? And do you have the basic physical capabilities to turn the steering wheel and press the brake?
Right.
Here, the license to take an animal's life isn't about brute strength. If a massive, strong man slaughters the animal, but his mind is completely blank and he doesn't comprehend the spiritual rules, the meat is legally worthless. Brute force without the license of spiritual intent is nothing.
That analogy maps perfectly onto the jurisprudence. The emphasis is overwhelmingly placed on the underlying intention and the proper, mindful execution of the established protocol. The brute, physical act of butchery is entirely secondary to the theological contract being fulfilled.
And that theological contract hinges almost entirely on the fleeting moments right before the blade touches the animal's skin,
It does, yes.
which provides the perfect transition into the next major pillar of this system. We've scrutinized the who, but the debate over what they say in those final seconds is honestly mind-boggling in its intensity. We are moving into the realm of the invocation, the tasmiyah.
The tasmiyah, the formal utterance of the name of God. Practically, this means saying Bismillah, which translates to in the name of God, precisely at the time of slaughter.
And the rules around this are intense.
Very. The text is unambiguous regarding the absolute baseline rule. If the slaughterer intentionally and deliberately decides to leave out the name of God, the meat is legally reclassified.
Classified how?
It is no longer food. It becomes maita, which means a dead, impure thing carrion. It is strictly, entirely unlawful to consume.
What is the underlying philosophy there? Why does a single phrase carry the power to turn a perfectly healthy steak into prohibited carrion?
The theological reasoning is that all life belongs exclusively to the Creator. A human being has no inherent right to extinguish the life of another sentient creature simply because they are hungry.
Right, it's not your property to destroy.
Exactly. Taking that life without explicitly, verbally acknowledging the Creator's overarching permission via the Damach, his name is categorized as an act of usurpation. It reduces the profound act of a divine concession to mere base killing. The word elevates the act.
Okay, if I hold the knife, look at the animal, and consciously refuse to say the name of God, it's forbidden. That is a clear, deliberate breach of contract.
Yeah.
But if you're listening to this, you know that human beings are notoriously flawed. We get distracted by a sudden noise, we get stressed, we simply forget things.
You absolutely do.
What happens if the person has every intention of following the rules, they are a devout believer, but they simply forget to say the words in the heat of the moment? This is where the heavyweights, Abu Hanifa, Imam Malik, Imam Shafi'i, step into the ring, and they have radically different interpretations of human error.
They absolutely do. And this specific debate exposes the deep underlying philosophies of their respective legal schools. Let's begin with Abu Hanifa.
Okay.
His view, which is the dominant perspective represented in our primary text, is that if the slaughterer genuinely accidentally forgets the invocation, the meat remains completely lawful to eat.
Really? So he gives them a pass?
Yes. His argument is profoundly empathetic to the reality of the human condition.
He's basically saying, we are wired to make mistakes, and the law shouldn't punish a glitch in memory.
Precisely. He argues that humans are inherently forgetful creatures, and divine law is designed to be lived and practiced, not to serve as an impossible trap of technicalities.
That makes a lot of sense.
He uses a compelling legal comparison, too. He points out that certain conditions in Islamic law are absolute physical states, like being in a state of ritual purity before performing the daily prayers. If you forget to attain that purity, your prayer is invalid, regardless of your good intentions, because the physical prerequisite was absent.
Right, because that's a physical state.
But slaughter is different. Because the slaughterer is already an established believer, Abu Hanifa argues that their overarching foundational belief acts as a silent proxy for the spoken word when memory fails. The text explicitly relies on the broader Islamic legal principle of removing undue hardship.
I see. It's almost like having an active subscription. Your overarching paid-up subscription to the faith covers this accidental momentary lapse in the vocal requirement.
I like that.
But Imam Malik looks at an exact same scenario and comes to a very different conclusion, doesn't he?
He does. Imam Malik adopts a much stricter text-literal methodology. In his legal framework, the meat of the animal slaughtered by a forgetful person is unlawful. Period.
Wow, no exceptions.
No exceptions. He does not factor in the overarching intent in the same way Abu Hanifa does. Malik leans heavily on the apparent literal phrasing of the Quranic verses that forbid eating meat over which God's name has not been pronounced.
So it's very black and white.
Very. For Malik, if the sound of the word did not enter the air, the legal condition was not met and the contract is void.
So Hanifa says the underlying belief saves it. Malik says the missing sound voids it. And then Imam Shafi'i walks in with a ruling that our text notes is highly controversial and actually goes against the general consensus of the earlier generations.
Yeah, Imam Shafi'i introduces a fascinating third paradigm. His view is that the meat is lawful, even if the invocation is intentionally and deliberately omitted by a Muslim slaughterer.
Wait, even if they do it on purpose?
Yes. His school often interprets the requirement to say the name of God not as a strict invalidating condition, but rather as a very strong recommendation, a sunnah. He argues that the inherent faith of the Muslim slaughterer is sufficient authorization in and of itself.
But our primary text, which heavily favors the Hanafi school, does not let Shafi'i off the hook for that opinion.
Not at all. The text pushes back vigorously against Shafi'i's view. It argues that the overwhelming consensus of the early Muslim community, including the most prominent companions of the Prophet, held that intentional omission absolutely, unequivocally renders the meat unlawful.
They were not having it.
No. The text even goes so far as to outline the judicial consequences, stating that a sitting judge cannot legally validate the sale of such meat in a market, because doing so would violate a foundational established consensus of the law.
So we have this massive debate about whether the words need to be said. But what happens when we look at the actual words themselves? The text gets incredibly granular about the linguistics of the prayer.
Oh, it's surgically precise.
It's not just about saying something holy. It's about the precise syntax of the utterance. For example, if a slaughterer is holding the knife and says, "In the name of God and so," adding a conjunction to include another name, the meat is instantly forbidden.
What's fascinating here is the absolute zero-tolerance policy for anything that even remotely hints at polytheism or divided theological loyalty. By utilizing the conjunction and the Arabic letter day, you are linguistically and structurally placing another entity on the exact same level as God in the very specific moment you are claiming divine permission to extinguish a life.
Wow.
The jurisprudence interprets this linguistic structure as implying a partnership in divine authority. Therefore, the meat is unlawful.
But the strictness goes even further than that. The text gives an example that really caught my attention. It says that if you say, Bismillah, Muhammad is the messenger of God, which, if you know anything about Islam, is the absolute core declaration of the faith.
It's the Shahada.
Exactly. But if you say it together as one continuous sentence without a pause, the act is considered legally disliked. You are combining the specific invocation required for slaughter with a general, overarching statement of faith. Why is that a problem?
The text relies on the guidance of a prominent companion of the Prophet, Ibn Masud, who advised slaughterers to strip the invocation bare.
Strip it bare.
Yes, the utterance must be purely, solely, and exclusively about invoking God for this specific monumental act of taking a life. If you attach something else to it, even a statement that is entirely true and profoundly holy, it muddies the specific intention.
That is so demanding.
The invocation for slaughter cannot be a compound sentence. It must be an isolated, deliberate, fiercely focused act.
Okay, I want to bring up the scenario that I found the most challenging in this entire section. It's the sneeze scenario.
Ah, yes.
The sneeze. The text outlines a situation where the slaughterer is holding the knife, the animal is ready, they're about to make the cut, and right at that exact millisecond, they sneeze.
Right.
Now, as a deep-seated cultural and religious reflex, they immediately say, Alhamdulillah, praise be to God. The text states that, according to the most authentic rulings, if they perform the cut at the moment they say that, the meat is invalid.
Yes.
Why? Because they intended the phrase, praise be to God, as a reaction to the sneeze, not as the invocation for the slaughter.
I have to push back hard here.
Go for it. If someone accidentally sneezes and their reflex is to praise God, how does that ruin the meat? This seems like prioritizing grammatical syntax over spiritual reality. Aren't we completely losing the forest for the trees here? If I'm a modern listener, this just sounds like an inescapable legal trap.
I completely understand why it strikes a modern ear that way. It sounds like an archaic legal technicality designed to trap a well-meaning person who just happened to have dust in their nose.
Exactly.
But if we connect this to the bigger picture of how this jurisprudence functions, we see a profound logic. In this framework, language is not just expressive, it is a binding contract. An utterance is a literal action. The internal intention behind the spoken word must perfectly seamlessly align with the physical action of the knife.
So the word and the blade have to be in perfect sync.
Exactly. If the intention behind uttering a habdidio was to respond to a sudden physiological reflex, the sneeze, then the legal slot required for the slaughter's invocation remains completely empty.
Ah, I see.
The verbal requirement wasn't fulfilled by an utterance intended for the slaughter. What this ruling is actually doing is highlighting the immense, almost terrifying gravity of taking a life. It cannot be done casually. It cannot be an afterthought to a bodily function. The presence of mind must be absolute.
If you are listening to this right now, think about your own focus. Think about how often you do something manually, chopping vegetables, driving a familiar route, typing an email while your brain is completely elsewhere, thinking about a podcast or your grocery list.
We all do it constantly.
This law is effectively saying, you cannot do that here. It demands an incredible, unbroken mindfulness. You cannot be on autopilot. You cannot be chatting with your buddy or distracted by a sneeze. You have to be entirely spiritually present in the exact moment of taking that life. It completely reframes the whole act from a mundane chore to a highly charged spiritual event.
It does. And what's truly remarkable about this text is that this intense, demanding spiritual protocol is matched by an equally, if not more demanding physical protocol regarding the anatomy of the animal itself. The mind must be precise, but the blade must be equally precise.
Let's dive into that physical protocol. We've established the who and the what they say. Now we need to look at the pure mechanics of the cut itself. Where exactly does this need to happen?
The text mandates a very specific target zone.
Right, between the throat, which it calls the holcum, and the upper chest area, the laba. And within that zone, it identifies 4 highly specific biological vessels that are the target of the blade.
The anatomy here is the crux of the physical law. The text identifies 4 distinct vital pathways in the neck. First, the holcum, which is the windpipe or trachea, responsible for respiration.
Okay.
Second, the mari, which is the esophagus or food pipe, responsible for nourishment.
Wow.
And third and fourth, the 2 wadjen, which are the thick jugular veins located on either side of the neck.
Okay, so windpipe, esophagus, 2 jugulars.
Exactly. The fundamental overriding goal of the physical thaka is to achieve a rapid, massive outpouring of blood, what the text vividly describes as the gushing of blood, and the swiftest possible dispatch of the animal to minimize its suffering.
But because this is a classical text of legal jurisprudence, they don't just leave it at cut the neck. There is a fierce, highly technical debate among the scholars about exactly how many of those 4 specific vessels must be severed to secure a passing grade and make the meat lawful.
Of course there is.
Abu Hanifa, as he often does, takes a somewhat mathematical, pragmatic approach. He argues that cutting any 3 of these 4 vessels is sufficient. If you get 3 out of 4, the meat is lawful. Why 3?
His logic is deeply rooted in a broader legal principle he employs across various areas of law. The principle that the majority takes the ruling of the whole.
Majority rules.
Yeah. Since severing 3 out of 4 constitutes a clear majority of the vital vessels, it practically guarantees the primary goal, which is rapid, irreversible blood loss and death. Therefore, 3 is legally sufficient. It is a pragmatic, results-oriented approach.
But his own students didn't agree.
Right, correct. His top students and intellectual peers, Abu Yusuf and Imam Muhammad, look at the exact same anatomy and disagree with his math. They require specific combinations of vessels.
I found their dissenting arguments really fascinating because they step away from pure math and look deeply at the biological function of each individual vessel. For example, Abu Yusuf initially argued that you absolutely must cut the windpipe, the esophagus, and at least one of the 2 jugular veins. You can't just pick any 3 at random.
Abu Yusuf's reasoning is strictly physiological.
Yeah.
He analyzes the systems of the body. He points out that the windpipe is the sole pathway for air, and the esophagus is the sole pathway for food and water. Both of these must be severed because they are distinct, singular systems that are absolutely vital for life. You cannot compromise on them.
And the jugulars.
When he looks at the jugular veins, He sees a redundant biological system. They both perform the exact same function of carrying blood. Therefore, severing just one of them achieves the necessary hemorrhage. One can legally and biologically stand in for the other.
So interesting. And Imam Muhammad had a different take entirely.
Yes, Imam Muhammad introduced yet another variation, suggesting that the requirement isn't about the number of vessels, but the completeness of the cut. He argued you must cut the majority of each individual vessel. So you can't just nick the windpipe, you have to sever more than half of its diameter.
What this debate reveals is how deeply and how seriously these classical jurists were engaging with the physical, biological realities of the act, not just debating abstract theological theory.
Absolutely. They were functioning as anatomists as much as legal scholars.
And what about the tools used to make these precise cuts? The text says you can use anything sharp enough to effectively shed blood. It lists a sharp reed, a sharp stone, iron.
Standard tools for the era.
But then it introduces a very specific and honestly somewhat gruesome exception. It says you cannot use teeth or nails. And it makes a point to specify, especially if those teeth or nails are still attached to a person.
Yeah, that part is quite striking. The text explicitly forbids the use of what it calls a standing tooth or a standing nail. If a person were to use their attached teeth or fingernails to tear open the throat of an animal, the resulting meat is considered unlawful carrion.
Which is horrifying to even picture.
It is. The legal reasoning provided here is twofold. First, there's the mechanical reality. An attached tooth or a fingernail does not slice cleanly through tissue like a honed blade. It crushes, it tears, and it bludgeons, which effectively results in strangling the animal rather than bleeding it.
And strangulation is a big no.
Exactly. Death by strangulation is explicitly and categorically forbidden in the Quran. Second, the text is responding to a very specific historical context. It references a statement from the Prophet where he referred to teeth and nails as the knives of the Abyssinians.
Which tells us that tearing animals apart with teeth or nails was a known existing cultural practice that this new Islamic law was specifically intentionally trying to outlaw because of its inherent cruelty.
Precisely. It was a direct repudiation of a brutal, primitive method of killing. And the law is so strict on this principle that the text notes that even if you were to detach a tooth from an animal or a horn and sharpen it to a razor edge to use as a knife, it is still legally disliked.
Even if it works perfectly.
Even if it works perfectly. Even though a sharpened horn fulfills the physical requirement of having a sharp edge, it is considered morally reprehensible because you are utilizing a part of a human or an animal's body as an instrument of slaughter. The jurists argue this violates a fundamental principle of dignity, and practically it is likely to cause unnecessary difficulty and extended pain to the animal compared to a proper iron blade.
Which brings us to what I found to be one of the most remarkable and frankly unexpected parts of this entire text: the stringent animal welfare mandates.
It's a huge component.
When we think of ancient medieval legal codes, our minds don't usually go to progressive animal rights. But this text is incredibly strict about how the animal is treated both before and during the slaughter process.
It is a profound and central aspect of the jurisprudence. The entire physical process is governed by a foundational, overarching principle quoted from the Prophet. God has prescribed excellence in everything, so when you kill, kill well, and when you slaughter, slaughter well. Let each one of you sharpen his blade, and let him spare suffering in the animal he slaughters.
Kill well and slaughter well. That's a powerful mandate.
It is. In this legal framework, this isn't just a polite suggestion or a best practice. It is a binding legal mandate to proactively minimize pain and distress.
The specific examples the text gives to illustrate this excellence are really striking. It says it is deeply disliked, which in this legal terminology means sinful, to physically lay the animal down on the ground, restrain it, and then start visibly sharpening your knife right in front of its eyes.
Yeah, that is a huge violation.
There's a very famous hadith quoted in the text where the Prophet observes a man doing exactly this and sharply reprimands him, asking, "Do you wish to kill it twice? Why didn't you sharpen your blade before laying it down?"
What is remarkable there is that the psychological terror of the animal is actively taken into account by the law. The jurisprudence recognizes that the animal is a sentient creature that experiences profound fear, and inducing that fear unnecessarily through your own carelessness is a direct violation of the divine command to show mercy.
The text also explicitly states that it is disliked to drag the animal by its leg to the slaughtering area. You have to walk it there calmly.
Right, preserve its dignity.
And then during the actual physical act of the cut, there are strict rules against overzealousness. You cannot cut so deeply and violently that you sever the spinal cord, what modern processors might call pithing, and you absolutely cannot completely chop the animal's head off before it has stopped moving and the life has fully left its body.
The specific Arabic term used in the text is nak, which refers to cutting so deep that you reach the white marrow of the spine. Severing the spinal cord instantly paralyzes the animal's body, but crucially, it does not instantly stop its brain from processing the sensation of pain.
Oh, wow, so they understood that.
Yes, doing this, or breaking the animal's neck before the involuntary post-cut thrashing is completely ceased, is legally considered an infliction of agonizing, entirely unnecessary pain. The text is definitive. Anything that causes additional unnecessary pain in the process of slaughter is legally disliked and sinful, even if it doesn't technically render the resulting meat unlawful to eat.
Reading through these welfare mandates, the image that kept coming to my mind wasn't a modern industrial slaughterhouse, which we know can be chaotic, loud, and brutally mechanical. It felt much more like reading the rules for a high-stakes surgical theater.
That's a very apt comparison.
You need incredibly sharp, precise instruments prepared in advance. You need a calm, strictly controlled environment to keep the patient's heart rate down. You need an operator who knows exactly what microscopic decils to cut and exactly what nerves to avoid. It's an intensely controlled, almost clinical procedure.
If we connect this intense anatomical focus to the bigger picture, we see the law attempting something profoundly difficult. It is attempting to balance the undeniable biological human need for food, the necessity of consumption, with the absolute moral imperative to minimize the suffering of God's sentient creatures.
It's a delicate balance.
It refuses to look away from the violence of the act. It acknowledges the inherent violence, but it insists on wrapping that violence in an incredibly strict, unyielding code of ethics, precision, and empathy.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though, because everything we've talked about so far, the surgical precision, the calm environment, isolating the 4 specific veins in the neck, all of that assumes a perfectly cooperative, docile, domesticated animal standing quietly.
Right. And animals are animals.
Exactly. What happens when this surgical precision is physically entirely impossible? What if the animal is wild? Or what if it completely loses its mind and goes out of control?
This is where classical jurisprudence demonstrates its inherent flexibility through the legal principle of necessity. The text logically divides all lawful slaughter into 2 distinct categories. Ikhtiari, which translates to the optional, precise, localized neck cut we've just been discussing, and idtirari, which is the slaughter of absolute necessity.
And the slaughter of necessity is basically the ultimate contingency plan. If you absolutely cannot reach the neck, you are allowed to wound the animal anywhere on its body to kill it, and the meat is still lawful. I imagine this applies primarily to hunting, right?
Correct. For wild game like a gazelle or a wild bird, you cannot realistically expect to catch it, lay it down gently, and calmly cut its 4 neck veins.
Obviously not.
Therefore, the law adapts to the reality of the situation. If a hunter shoots an arrow or releases a highly trained hunting dog or a falcon, and they ensure, they say, the invocation, the Bismillah, at the exact moment the weapon or animal is released, the subsequent wound that brings down and kills the game is considered a lawful thaka.
So the requirement shifts.
Yes, the correct requirement dramatically shifts. It moves from the physical precision of the neck cut to the spiritual presence of the intention at the very initiation of the hunt.
But what fascinated me is that the text also applies this rule of the feral to domesticated animals under very specific chaotic circumstances.
Yes, the feral cow rule.
If a domesticated cow or a camel suddenly breaks its halter, goes totally feral out in the open desert, and violently resists any attempt at capture, it temporarily changes legal categories.
It becomes wild game, essentially.
Right. Or, in a very vivid, almost cinematic example the text provides, what if a sheep falls headfirst down a narrow, deep well? You can see it, it's alive, but you absolutely cannot physically reach its neck to perform the proper surgical cut before it dies from the fall. What do you do?
In those extreme scenarios, the strict physical requirement of the ikhtiari neck cut is officially lifted due to a state of absolute inability. The text rules that if you wound the feral cow with an arrow to stop it, or if you manage to drop a spear and stab the trapped sheep anywhere on its body to hasten its death and release its blood, while ensuring you say the invocation, the resulting meat is lawful.
So you have to prove you couldn't do it the normal way.
Crucially, yes. The defining legal element here is the establishment of incapacity, or HS. The law does not give you a free pass to just shoot your livestock. For instance, Imam Muhammad argues that if a cow breaks loose inside a walled city, where it could eventually be cornered in an alleyway and safely caught, you cannot just shoot it with an arrow.
You have to try and catch it.
You are legally obligated to capture it and perform the proper neck cut. But out in the open, limitless desert, where capture is genuinely impossible, the rule of necessity takes over.
There is one edge case in this section that I found totally fascinating, and reading the text, it clearly sparked a massive, protracted debate among the scholars. It's the debate about the unborn fetus.
Oh, this is a complex one.
What happens if a farmer lawfully slaughters a pregnant cow or a sheep? They open the animal up and they find a fully formed but now dead fetus inside the womb. Is that fetus lawful to eat?
This represents one of the most complex intersections of legal theory and ancient biological understanding in the entire text. Abu Hanifa takes a very strict, biologically separate stance. The dead fetus cannot be eaten.
Because it didn't get its own cut.
Precisely. His foundational logic is that the fetus is an entirely separate biological entity with its own distinct life, its own body, and its own blood. Since the slaughterer's knife did not physically cut the fetus's specific throat, and the impure blood did not drain from its specific jugular veins, it is essentially carrion. He argues that the lawful slaughter of the mother does not magically transfer through the uterine wall to the fetus.
But his own star students, Abu Yusuf and Muhammad, along with Imam Shafi'i, look at the exact same scenario and completely disagree. They rule that if the fetus is fully formed, the text uses the milestone of if it has hair, it is lawful to eat. And their argument relies on a very different understanding of biological connection.
Yes, they argue an ancient biological concept. The slaughter of the mother is the slaughter of the fetus. To understand their justification, we have to step away from a 21st century understanding of totally independent circulatory systems and look at how these classical jurists conceptualize biological life within the womb.
How did they see it?
They viewed the fetus not as a radically separate entity, but as an integral, fundamentally connected extension of the mother's own body. They argued it breathes through her respiration, it feeds entirely through her nutrients, and it shares her vital essence. Therefore, the legal and spiritual purification of the mother's body through proper slaughter inherently extends to the fetus contained within it.
It's like a 2-for-1.
Exactly. Furthermore, they explicitly equate this to the slaughter of necessity we just discussed.
Yeah.
Just as you physically cannot reach a feral cow's neck in the desert, you literally cannot reach the fetus's neck while it is encased in the womb. Therefore, the mother's slaughter suffices as a necessary legal substitute.
Okay, I have to push back on this whole concept of necessity, though. If we go back to the very beginning of this deep dive, we established that the entire physical point of the strict surgical neck cut is to properly drain the flowing blood to make the meat biologically and spiritually pure.
Yes, that is the physical mechanism.
How does a sheep falling down a well suddenly make an arrow to the flank magically purify the meat? The blood isn't draining from the jugulars, it's pooling in the body cavity. Isn't this just a massive pragmatic loophole designed so people didn't have to waste expensive meat?
It is an excellent critical question, and it cuts to the very heart of how Islamic jurisprudence operates as a lived system. It is not a blind, inflexible, robotic machine. It operates fundamentally on the principle of human capacity.
Meaning it knows our limits.
Exactly. The divine law, as interpreted by these scholars, is meant to guide human behavior toward the ideal, but it explicitly refuses to demand the physically impossible.
Right.
When the physical ideal, the perfect draining of blood from the neck, is rendered impossible by circumstance, the law intentionally adapts so as not to place an unbearable, undue hardship on the people.
So intention fills the gap.
The intention and the spoken invocation, the spiritual contract, bridge the gap where physical precision fails. The law essentially recognizes that in a situation of genuine necessity, the earnest attempt to shed blood and take the life lawfully, coupled with the name of God, is the absolute best a human being can do. And in this theological framework, God accepts the best a human can do when perfection is out of reach.
It's a pragmatic grace. The system is rigid until rigidity becomes impossible, and then it bends. So the method of killing can adapt to necessity. But while the how can change, the actual type of animal you are allowed to kill and put on your dinner plate is rigidly, unflinchingly fixed. Which leads us into the fascinating ancient taxonomy of what is halal, lawful, and what is haram, unlawful.
The overarching foundational rule that governs this entire section is derived from a direct, explicit statement of the Prophet. It categorizes the animal kingdom based on two highly visible physical characteristics.
Fangs and talons, right?
Yes. Any predatory animal that possesses fangs, lions, wolves, dogs, tigers, leopards, is categorically forbidden. And any predatory bird that possesses talons for hunting hawks, eagles, falcons, owls is forbidden.
And what I loved about this section is that the text provides a profound philosophical reason for this prohibition. It isn't just a primitive fear of predators, and it isn't just an ancient guess about hygiene or disease. The text explicitly states that the core reason for this prohibition is to honor humanity.
That's right.
It argues that by eating these specific animals, humans risk actually absorbing their savage, predatory, and violent behavioral traits.
This is a truly remarkable concept. The jurisprudence here operates on a kind of metaphysical biology. It suggests that human consumption is not merely a transaction of caloric intake or protein synthesis. It is a literal absorption of characteristics.
So you take on the spirit of the animal.
The text posits that the nature of the beast resides in its flesh. To protect the dignity, the empathy, and the moral character of human beings, they are strictly forbidden from consuming creatures whose very nature and survival are defined by violence, aggressive hunting, and tearing the flesh of others.
It's the ultimate ancient version of the phrase, "you are what you eat," taken to a literal psychological extreme. And this metaphysical logic extends directly to scavengers, too. Birds, like certain types of crows or vultures that subsist entirely on carrion and rotting meat, are forbidden.
Yes, the scavengers?
But the text makes a very specific behavioral distinction that proves the rule. It states that a crow that eats only seeds and grains from the crops is perfectly lawful to eat. So it's not about the shape of the bird's beak or its species name. It's entirely about the nature of its diet and its daily behavior.
Exactly. The diet dictates the biological and spiritual purity of the flesh. This underlying philosophy is also why the text categorically forbids the consumption of all insects, wasps, and terrestrial reptiles, like turtles, snakes, and lizards. Although it should be noted that Imam Shafi'i has a dissenting opinion, allowing the consumption of certain lizards based on specific historical reports from the Prophet's companions.
But generally, they are a no-go.
Generally, yes. The Hanafi school views all these creeping creatures as fundamentally subsisting on impurities or inhabiting impure, muddy environments, which inherently renders their flesh biologically and spiritually unfit for the honored human constitution.
Let's talk about beasts of burden, because this is where the rules get incredibly specific and highly debated regarding the animals humans interact with daily. Domestic donkeys and mules are strictly, unequivocally forbidden by consensus, but horses. The debate over eating horse meat is massive.
The debate over horse meat is a perfect textbook example of how different legal priorities and principles collide in classical law. Abu Hanifa rules that eating horse meat is deeply disliked, bordering on entirely forbidden.
Because they're impure.
No, his primary reasoning is not dietary or based on the animal's purity. His reasoning is intensely strategic and logistical. In the ancient and medieval world, horses were the primary, indispensable instruments of war, of national defense, and of jihad. They were the tanks, the transport vehicles, and the fighter jets of the era.
Oh, wow. I didn't even think of that.
Abu Hanifa argued that to casually slaughter a war horse for a meal was to actively deplete the critical military resources of the community. It was quite literally a matter of national security. Furthermore, to bolster his strategic view, he points to a specific Quranic verse that lists horses, mules, and donkeys as animals created for you to ride and as an adornment. He notes that the verse notably omits the phrase, "for you to eat," which is explicitly mentioned in verses discussing cattle and sheep.
So Hanifa basically says, don't eat the military budget. But the other scholars, including his own top students and Imam Shafi'i, push back hard. They say horse meat is completely lawful. And they base this entirely on historical records showing that the Prophet explicitly permitted the consumption of horse meat during the military expedition of Khaybar, while at the very same time forbidding the meat of domestic donkeys. They argue the dietary law supersedes the logistical concern.
Yes, their counter-argument is that while a horse is undeniably useful for war, its utility does not inherently make its flesh spiritually or biologically impure. They argue that a temporary strategic need does not permanently alter the divine dietary categorization of the animal. The debate beautifully highlights the tension jurists face between interpreting the law based on overarching social utility and public interest versus adhering strictly to specific recorded historical precedents.
And then, amidst all these debates about war horses and predators, there's the rabbit. The text explicitly states that rabbits are entirely lawful. The reasoning provided is straightforward. They aren't predators, they don't possess fangs, they don't eat carrion, and there is a verified historical record of the Prophet accepting and eating a portion of roasted rabbit.
Right.
So what does this all mean? I want to push back on the transferring traits philosophy for a second. If the whole system is built on the worry about absorbing the nature of the animal, why is a slow-moving, completely harmless, gentle turtle completely forbidden, but a highly energetic, skittish, easily frightened rabbit is perfectly fine? Doesn't the metaphysical logic break down there? If I eat rabbit, shouldn't I become cowardly and skittish?
Right. It's a very perceptive pushback. The legal categorization isn't based solely on isolating the psychological temperament of the animal in a vacuum. It is a synthesized combination of dietary habits, biological structure, and explicit textual precedent. The turtle, as a creeping reptile, falls into the overarching legal category of kabayith within the Hanafi school. These are creatures deemed inherently base, repulsive, or subsisting in mud and impurity.
Ah, okay. And the rabbit?
The rabbit, however, is categorized differently. It is a pure herbivore. It grazes on clean vegetation, functioning biologically much like a miniature sheep or a deer. Crucially, it possesses warm, flowing blood that can be lawfully drained through the thaka process. Therefore, it meets all the strict criteria of a biologically pure herbivorous animal that is suitable for human consumption, regardless of how fast it runs away from predators.
Okay, so we have these incredibly complex, highly specific, philosophically dense rules for animals on land. We've talked about fangs, talons, diet, behavior, military strategy, and exactly how to cut the neck. But then, in the final section, the text turns its attention away from the land and looks at the ocean. And suddenly, the rules change so dramatically it gave me absolute whiplash.
The rules governing the creatures of the water are dictated by entirely different paradigms than the creatures of the land. According to the Hanafi school, which, as we've noted, is the primary voice guiding our core text, of all the millions of diverse creatures that live in the oceans, rivers, and lakes, only fish are lawful to eat.
Only fish.
Every single other aquatic creature, crabs, lobsters, shrimp, frogs, oysters, squid, is categorically considered kabaith, impure or unlawful.
If you are listening to this right now and you happen to love seafood, you are probably doing a double take. Under this specific Hanafi rule, your shrimp cocktail and your lobster bake are entirely off the table. Why only fish? What makes a crab so impure?
The Hanafi jurists interpret the general, overarching Quranic command that forbids the consumption of impure things as applying to absolutely all aquatic life with one single textually mandated exception: fish. They point to specific prophetic traditions that explicitly make exceptions only for fish. They argue that creatures like crabs, frogs, or shellfish lack the pure biological characteristics and the textual endorsement required for lawful consumption. To them, the ocean is a realm of impurity, with one specific granted exception.
But once again, the jurists are fighting it out over the interpretation. The text points out that Imam Malik and Imam Shafi'i look at the ocean and strongly, vehemently disagree with the Hanafis. They believe that absolutely everything in the sea is lawful.
Yes, Malik and Shafi'i lean on a very broad, very clear, and universally phrased Quranic verse. Lawful to you is the catch of the sea and its food. They take this verse at its absolute, most universal face value. If a creature lives its life entirely in the ocean, it is permissible, full stop. You do not need to analyze its diet or its anatomy.
It's a completely different approach.
It is. This debate is a classic foundational example of Islamic legal methodology.
Yeah.
Do you take a broad, universal verse as the final, unassailable word, as Malik and Shafi'i do? Or do you allow specific, narrower, subsequent traditions to restrict and narrow that universal permission, as the Hanafis do?
But even within the strict Hanafi rule of only fish, there are further complications about how the fish actually dies. For land animals, we need the surgical cut. For fish, there's no cut required. But if you are walking along the river and you find a fish floating belly up in the water, meaning it clearly died of natural causes without any visible external reason, the text says it is disliked or unlawful to eat.
The specific Arabic term used in the text is tafi, referring to the floating fish. The biological and legal reasoning is that if a fish dies of an internal disease, old age, or unknown natural causes while just swimming in the water, it is legally categorized as a type of carrion. It's conceptually similar to a cow that just drops dead of a heart attack in a pasture. You cannot eat it.
But if it dies from something else?
However, the rule changes based on external factors. If the fish died because the tide went out and left it stranded on land, or if it died from a sudden extreme shift in water temperature, like freezing cold or boiling heat, or if it was cut by a boat or trapped and suffocated in a fisherman's net, it is lawful. The death must be clearly attributable to a recognizable external cause, environmental hazard, or human action, not an internal biological failing.
And this brings us to what might be the absolute strangest pairing in the entire text. It's a grouping that will sound bizarre to a modern ear. The text groups locusts, the swarming, crop-destroying desert insects, together with fish.
Yes, fish and locusts.
It states that fish and locust are the only two creatures in existence that are completely lawful to eat without any formal slaughter, invocation, or net cutting whatsoever, even if you just find a pile of them dead from natural causes. To a modern listener, grouping a swarming desert insect with an ocean-dwelling fish seems biologically wild. Why are these two entirely different creatures given the exact same legal loophole regarding slaughter?
This raises an incredibly important question about how ancient and medieval legal systems categorize the natural world, which is vastly different from how we do it today. Modern taxonomy groups animals by evolutionary lineage, DNA, and skeletal structure. Pre-modern jurisprudence, however, categorized them by observable physical traits, their elemental environment, and most importantly, explicit textual declarations.
So it's based on the text.
The primary legal linking of the fish and the locust is entirely textual. It is based on a very famous, highly explicit hadith where the Prophet states, "Two types of dead meat have been made lawful for us, fish and locusts."
So the law groups them together simply because the text grouped them together. It's textual first and foremost. But did the jurists find a physical, biological logic to justify pairing them?
Yes, they did, and it reveals a brilliant physiological rationale that underpins the entire text. The jurists analyzed both the fish and the locust and realized they share a crucial negative trait. Neither of them possesses the type of flowing, easily drainable warm blood that land mammals do.
Oh, because they're cold-blooded or insect?
Exactly.
Mhm.
Remember, we established at the very beginning that the entire physical point of the strict neck cut, the thaka, is to achieve the rapid outpouring of impure flowing blood. If a biological organism simply does not have a circulatory system with that kind of flowing blood, the physical mechanism of slitting the throat to drain it is entirely irrelevant, redundant, and biologically impossible.
That's fascinating.
Therefore, the internal logic of the law exempts them from the physical protocol of slaughter entirely.
It's a perfectly logical, internally consistent conclusion based entirely on the foundational premise. If the goal of the law is draining blood, and the creature has no blood to drain, the rule simply doesn't apply. The system works.
It perfectly demonstrates the deep internal consistency of this legal framework. Even when dealing with vastly different creatures from completely different environments, the underlying principles remained remarkably steady.
We have covered an incredible amount of ground today. We started simply by looking at a piece of shrink-wrapped meat on a dinner plate, and we've journeyed deep into an ancient legal text that constructs a truly comprehensive, meticulous worldview.
A very demanding worldview.
Yes. This Book of Slaughter isn't just about avoiding certain types of meat or following arbitrary rules. It is a rigorous, demanding ethical system. It mandates a surprisingly high level of animal welfare. It demands intense, unbroken spiritual mindfulness from the person holding the knife. And it strictly, philosophically defines humanity's exact relationship with the natural world and the creatures that inhabit it.
And I think it is crucial to remember, whether you personally adhere to these specific dietary laws or whether you're just encountering them for the first time today, studying a classical text like this offers a profound masterclass in human civilization. It shows us how legal and ethical systems attempt to bring order, deep moral meaning, and a sense of the sacred to the absolute most basic, visceral human necessity, act of eating. It forces us to slow down and recognize that consumption is never just a neutral, invisible act.
Which leaves me with a final thought, something we haven't explicitly discussed yet, but that has been lingering in the back of my mind while reading the core logic of this text.
What's that?
We spent a lot of time talking about the strict prohibition on eating predatory animals, the wolves, the hawks, the lions. And the text's underlying metaphysical philosophy was that we must avoid consuming them so that humans don't accidentally absorb their savage, violent, and predatory behavioral traits.
No, no.
But if we look at our modern industrialized food systems today, we don't eat wolves. We eat docile, gentle herbivores, cows, sheep, chickens. But the massive industrial system we use to process them, to raise them and dispatch them by the millions, often treats these living creatures with a cold, mechanical ruthlessness that these ancient laws explicitly, furiously outlawed.
It's the exact opposite of excellence in slaughter.
Exactly. So the provocative quotient is, if the ancient premise is true, and we truly are what we eat, are we absorbing different negative traits today? Not from the nature of the animal itself, but from the unfeeling, highly industrialized, profit-driven machinery of how it was processed. Is the meat we buy at the supermarket infused with the cold trauma of its own production?
That is a deeply unsettling and incredibly vital question to consider. It takes the ancient metaphysical philosophy of this classical text and bridges it directly and uncomfortably into our modern reality.
It is definitely something to ponder the next time you sit down to dinner and look at your plate. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.